Welcome to Sleepy American Food History, where old American kitchens grow warm again, one quiet story at a time. The kitchen is quiet now. A small enamel pot rests on the back of a cast iron stove. The flame beneath it has nearly gone out, but the room still holds a little warmth. On the table are 4 bowls, a heel of bread, and a jar that once held peaches. Outside, a streetcar passes somewhere beyond the dark window. Its sound is distant enough to feel almost like weather. It is the early 1930s, and this kitchen could be in Cleveland, Birmingham, Chicago, rural Kansas, or any one of thousands of American communities living through a crisis that entered the home one unpaid bill at a time. What would dinner be tonight? That question did not have one national answer. Some families had a sack of potatoes but no meat. Some had flour, cornmeal, or beans stored against the season. Some lived near relatives who kept chickens. Others stood in a relief line and carried home whatever was being distributed that week. A child in a city school might receive soup and milk. A migrant family on the road might cook beside a temporary camp. A farm household could be surrounded by land and still have almost no cash. The Great Depression is often remembered through a few familiar images: bread lines, soup kitchens, dusty fields, and thin men looking for work. Those images are real, but they are only part of the food story. Much of that story took place quietly, in ordinary kitchens where people measured flour by habit, saved bacon grease in a tin, soaked beans overnight, and found one more use for yesterday's bread. By 1933, nearly 1/4 of the American labor force was unemployed. Even those who kept their jobs often faced reduced wages or shorter hours. Bank failures erased savings. Farm prices had already been weak for years, and drought made life even harder across parts of the Great Plains. Yet the burden was not evenly shared. Black families, Mexican-American communities, immigrant neighborhoods, tenant farmers, domestic workers, and people already living close to poverty often entered the Depression with fewer protections and faced discrimination in employment and relief. Food became a daily calculation. How much could be bought with the coins left after rent? Which meal could be stretched with water, gravy, bread, rice, or potatoes? Could a neighbor trade eggs for sewing? Would the grocer extend credit for another week? Was there enough fuel to cook slowly? Would the children eat first? This journey is not a search for a single famous Depression recipe. It is a quiet history of choices. We will move from city groceries to farm gardens, from relief kitchens to school lunchrooms, and from family tables to the first federal food stamp experiment. We will look at the foods people relied upon, but also at the systems that decided which foods were available and who could obtain them. The meal in the enamel pot might be bean soup. It might be potatoes cooked with onion, a little flour, and milk. It might be a stew made from leftovers, or a thin tomato and pasta dish remembered under many local names. The important thing is not that every family ate the same meal. They did not. The important thing is that millions of people learned to make food perform more work than it had before. They asked bread to become breakfast, lunch, and thickener. They asked a small piece of meat to flavor a whole pot. They asked gardens to supply what wages could not. They asked leftovers to return in a different form. And as the decade continued, they increasingly asked local charities, schools, and the federal government to help bridge the distance between farm surplus and household hunger. So, for a while, let the room grow still. Imagine the worn tabletop, the soft scrape of a spoon, and the careful way a loaf is turned before the next slice is cut. To understand what poor Americans ate during the Great Depression, we should begin not with a recipe, but with the moment when an ordinary household realized that tomorrow's food could no longer be taken for granted. Before the crash of 1929, American eating had already been changing. Cities were larger, packaged foods were more common, chain groceries were expanding, while neighborhood stores still offered personal service and, in many places, informal credit. Canned milk, breakfast cereals, crackers, evaporated soups, and other commercial products had become familiar parts of the national food supply, yet older patterns remained strong. Families baked, canned, preserved, gardened, and relied on regional staples that had been carried through generations. Then income disappeared. A household budget that had once included a roast, fresh fruit, coffee, and a few small treats might suddenly be reduced to rent, fuel, and the cheapest filling foods available. The problem was not always that food vanished from the market. In many places, stores still displayed bread, meat, canned goods, and produce. The difficulty was that people could not afford to buy them. This is one of the central contradictions of the Depression. Farmers struggled with low prices and unsold crops, while urban families struggled to obtain enough food. Abundance and hunger existed at the same time, separated by money, transportation, policy, and access. The neighborhood grocer often stood at that boundary. In working-class districts, a shopkeeper might know every customer by name. Purchases could be written in a small account book and paid after payday. When paydays stopped, those accounts grew. Some grocers continued extending credit because the customers were neighbors, relatives, or members of the same church or ethnic community. But a small store could not carry unlimited debt. Eventually, the pencil line in the account book became another source of worry. Families responded by changing how they shopped. They bought smaller quantities. They watched prices closely. They chose foods that produced many servings and could be stored without spoilage. Flour, cornmeal, dried beans, rice, rolled oats, potatoes, onions, cabbage, and bread became valuable because they were flexible. A pound of meat might be beyond reach, but a small piece of salt pork, a soup bone, or a little ground meat could flavor a larger dish. Milk was nutritionally important, especially for children, but regular access depended on income, refrigeration, local supply, and relief programs. Food habits also depended on housing. A rural household might have a pantry, root cellar, smokehouse, garden plot, or access to wood for cooking. A city family in a rented room might have one burner and no reliable refrigerator. A household with an electric refrigerator could keep milk and leftovers longer, but many Americans still used ice boxes or had no mechanical cooling at all. Fuel cost mattered. A long-simmered pot of beans was economical only if there was enough coal, wood, gas, or electricity to cook it. This is why advice from the period could sound sensible on paper and still be difficult in practice. Home economists recommended balanced menus, careful shopping, and efficient cooking. These ideas helped many families, but a plan that assumed access to milk, fresh vegetables, an oven, and several hours of fuel did not fit every kitchen. The poorest households often had to choose among nutrition, price, time, and equipment. The grocery list became shorter and more exact. Children could be sent to purchase a few cents worth of an ingredient. Adults learned which stores marked down bread late in the day. A bruised apple, a cracked egg, or a soup bone might be valuable if sold cheaply. Packaging was saved. Flour sacks became household cloth. Glass jars returned to the pantry. Paper bags were folded for another use. Nothing in this story was entirely new. Poor Americans had practiced thrift long before 1929. Black sharecroppers, immigrant laborers, mining families, and many rural households already knew how to stretch food through unstable seasons and low wages. What changed was the scale. Practices once associated with chronic poverty became necessary for millions more people. And when money could no longer decide the meal, the household turned toward the oldest dependable foods, starches, legumes, and grains that could fill a pot, absorb flavor, and carry a family from one day to the next. They could be boiled, mashed, fried in a little fat, added to soup, baked when fuel allowed, or combined with flour and leftovers. They provided bulk, and they accepted almost any flavor available: onion, salt, pepper, milk, gravy, bacon grease, or the juices from a small piece of meat. Beans performed a similar kind of work. Dried beans were inexpensive, stored well, and could become soup, baked beans, bean cakes, or a thick filling for a meal. In the South and Southwest, different bean traditions were already deeply established. In northern cities, immigrant households brought their own ways of seasoning and serving legumes. The Depression did not invent these foods. It increased their importance in households that needed every ingredient to travel farther. Cornmeal was especially important in many rural and southern kitchens. It became cornbread, mush, griddle cakes, or a coating for fried foods. Oats could provide breakfast or thicken baked dishes. Rice was central in many regions, especially where long-standing African, Caribbean, Asian, Latin American, and Southern foodways had made it familiar. Pasta, noodles, and dumplings stretched soups and sauces across immigrant neighborhoods and beyond. Bread might have been the most versatile food of all. Fresh bread was eaten with meals. Stale bread could be toasted, softened in milk, turned into crumbs, added to meat mixtures, layered into puddings, or used beneath gravy. A slice covered with creamed vegetables, chipped meat, or a simple white sauce became a complete plate when little else was available. The phrase, stretching a meal, describes more than adding water. It meant choosing a base that could carry a smaller, stronger ingredient. A few spoonfuls of tomatoes could color a pot of macaroni. A piece of salt pork could season beans. A little cheese could be grated over potatoes. An onion, slowly cooked, could make a thin soup feel deeper. Flour and fat could become gravy, and gravy could make bread or potatoes feel like dinner. Some remembered dishes are now grouped under broad labels, such as Depression food. That label can be useful, but it should be handled carefully. Many of these meals existed before the 1930s. Families had long made potato soup, bean soup, cornmeal mush, bread pudding, cabbage dishes, hash, and simple stews. During the Depression, these foods became more visible because economy was no longer a private concern. Newspapers, radio programs, home economics departments, charities, and government agencies all discussed low-cost eating. Recipes without costly ingredients also circulated widely. Cakes made without butter, milk, or eggs are often called depression cakes today, though their exact origins vary, and similar recipes appeared in other periods of scarcity. Mock dishes also attracted attention. Some used crackers, seasoning, or inexpensive vegetables to suggest the texture of a more expensive food. But the name mock did not necessarily mean a family was pretending to be wealthy. It often meant a cook understood texture, seasoning, and expectation well enough to produce something satisfying from what was available. Breakfast was often simple: oatmeal, cornmeal mush, bread, potatoes, or leftovers from supper could begin the day. Coffee might be weakened, stretched, replaced, or reserved for adults. Children might receive milk when the household could afford it, or when a relief program supplied it. Eggs were easier to obtain for families with chickens or nearby farm connections, but they were not automatically cheap or plentiful for everyone. Lunch depended on work, school, and location. A worker might carry bread with a small filling, cold potatoes, a piece of fruit in season, or leftovers wrapped in paper. A child might go home to eat, carry a lunch, or receive food through a local school program. An unemployed adult might skip the midday meal or visit a relief kitchen. Dinner gathered whatever remained. The meal might be a one-pot dish because one pot used less fuel and created fewer dishes to wash. It might contain potatoes, cabbage, beans, pasta, or rice, with meat serving as flavor rather than center. It might be filling but nutritionally limited. Hunger was not always an empty plate. Sometimes it was the repeated plate. Enough calories to quiet the stomach, but too little variety over weeks. Cooks learned how to brown flour without burning it, how to save pot liquor from beans or greens, how to revive bread, how to use every edible trimming, and how to change the shape of leftovers so that yesterday's supper did not appear unchanged. That leads us to the small scraps, bones, gravies, and second meals that made the Depression kitchen an expert workshop in avoiding waste. A roast, when a family could obtain one, was rarely just one meal. The first dinner might include sliced meat, The next day, smaller pieces could become hash with potatoes and onion. Bones might simmer into broth. Fat could be saved for frying or baking. Gravy could return over bread, biscuits, rice, or mashed potatoes. Even the brown bits in the pan had value. This pattern was older than the Depression, but the economic crisis made it more deliberate. The same was true of a chicken. In a household that kept birds, an older hen might be stewed slowly rather than roasted quickly. The meat could be divided among several servings, while the broth carried dumplings, noodles, rice, or vegetables. Giblets and other edible parts were used. Nothing was discarded merely because it was less fashionable. Commercial meat counters offered their own hierarchy. Steaks and roasts belonged to households with money. Working families looked toward cheaper cuts: ground meat, salt pork, liver, kidneys, hearts, neck bones, and soup bones. These foods were not eaten everywhere, and many had strong cultural traditions independent of poverty. Yet they mattered because slow cooking could turn tougher cuts into tender dishes, and strong flavors could season inexpensive starches. Meatloaf illustrates the logic of extension. Ground meat could be combined with breadcrumbs, oats, crackers, onion, milk, or other binders. The loaf was easier to slice evenly than a small piece of meat, and leftovers could become sandwiches. Similar mixtures appeared as patties, croquettes, or hash. The goal was not deception, it was distribution. White sauce served a related purpose. Made from fat, flour, and milk when available, it could carry peas, chipped beef, tuna, eggs, or leftover vegetables over toast. The sauce added moisture and made a modest amount of food cover several plates. In homes with little milk, broth or water might substitute, producing a thinner gravy. Casseroles and one-dish meals gained attention during the 1930s, especially in middle-class magazines and product cookbooks. They suited the era's interest in efficiency and leftovers. Canned foods, gelatin, mayonnaise, crackers, and condensed products appeared in many published recipes. These dishes remind us that the Depression table was not made only of rustic pots and farm staples. It was also part of a modern food industry that continued advertising convenience, novelty, and domestic efficiency even in hard times. But published recipes were not the same as universal practice. A magazine might recommend a molded salad with canned fruit, vegetables, or gelatin. A family reading it might own the magazine but lack the ingredients. Another family might prepare the dish for a church supper, holiday, or special Sunday meal, rather than an ordinary weeknight. Historical cookbooks tell us what was promoted and possible. They do not always tell us what every household actually ate. Leftovers offer a closer view of daily reality. The growing use of electric refrigerators helped some families keep food safely for longer periods. During the 1930s, refrigerator manufacturers lowered prices, and New Deal electrification and lending programs helped expand access. Yet adoption remained uneven. By 1940, electric refrigerators were present in a majority of American homes, but not all. Many rural households still lacked electricity, and many poor urban families could not afford the appliance. Without dependable cooling, leftover management required care. Food might be eaten quickly, kept in an icebox, stored in a cool pantry, or reheated thoroughly. In winter, cold weather offered temporary help. In summer, spoilage was a constant concern. The moral language around waste also grew stronger. Throwing away edible food could appear almost shameful when neighbors were hungry. "Use it up" became more than a household slogan. It represented an economy in which every crust, spoonful, and trimming carried labor and money. Bread ends became pudding. Sour milk, when safe and usable, entered baking. Vegetable cooking water became soup. Apple peels might flavor jelly in households with the time and equipment. Rendered fat waited in a covered container near the stove. A jar with one serving of beans could be added to a larger pot the next day. This thrift required work, and much of that work fell on women. Planning, shopping, preserving, cooking, washing, mending, and negotiating credit were forms of household management that often went unpaid and unnoticed. Women were expected to create nutrition and comfort from shrinking resources. When the meal succeeded, the scarcity could become nearly invisible. When it failed, the cook might be blamed for conditions no skill could overcome. The most fortunate households could stretch food already in their possession. Others had to produce it, trade for it, or gather it from the land. And so we leave the city kitchen for a quieter place, where a garden row, a chicken coop, and a shelf of jars might separate a difficult winter from an impossible one. A farm could look like abundance from the road. There might be fields, a barn, chickens, fruit trees, and a vegetable patch. Yet many farm families were deeply poor. Crop prices had fallen after World War I. Debt was common. Tenant farmers and sharecroppers did not necessarily own the land they worked. Drought and soil erosion destroyed harvests across parts of the plains. A household could raise food and still lack cash for taxes, medicine, clothing, machinery, or food it could not produce. The difference between food and income shaped rural meals. Farm families with land, tools, seed, water, labor, and a suitable climate could grow potatoes, beans, corn, greens, tomatoes, cabbage, onions, squash, or fruit. They might keep chickens for eggs, a cow for milk, or hogs for meat. Hunting and fishing supplemented diets in some regions. Barter connected households: eggs for flour, milk for repair work, garden produce for sowing. But none of these resources should be romanticized. A garden required seed, strength, time, and rain. Livestock required feed. Canning required jars, lids, fuel, knowledge, and hours of labor. A failed crop could not be replaced by optimism. In the Dust Bowl, gardens withered and animals weakened. In the tenant South, land use might be controlled by an owner who prioritized cotton or another cash crop. Black farmers and sharecroppers faced discriminatory credit systems and unequal access to relief. Mexican-American farm workers and migrant families often lived with unstable employment and poor housing. Still, self-provisioning mattered. A family garden could reduce the need for cash purchases. Spring greens brought variety after winter. Beans and peas could be eaten fresh or dried. Corn became meal, hominy, or animal feed. Cabbage stored well and could be cooked, fermented, or combined with potatoes. Fruit might be dried, preserved, or canned when sugar and jars were available. Canning shelves became a form of household security. Rows of tomatoes, beans, peaches, pickles, or preserves represented summer labor saved for winter. Extension agents, home demonstration clubs, and government programs promoted safe canning and garden planning. Community canneries and relief projects appeared in some places, allowing families to process produce with shared equipment. These programs were not identical across the country, but they reflected a broad effort to turn seasonal surplus into durable food. The pantry also revealed regional identity. In Appalachia, dried beans, cornmeal, garden vegetables, apples, and preserved pork might shape the table. In the rural South, cornbread, field peas, greens, sweet potatoes, rice in some regions, and pork seasonings belonged to food traditions far older than the Depression. In the Southwest, beans, corn, chiles, and tortillas reflected Mexican and indigenous foodways. In northern farm country, potatoes, dairy products, bread, pickles, and preserved meats varied with immigrant settlement and local agriculture. Poverty did not erase culture. A simple meal could still follow family rules about seasoning, bread, prayer, serving order, and hospitality. People did not become generic poor Americans when money disappeared. They remained Italian American, African American, Polish American, Mexican American, Jewish, Norwegian American, Cherokee, Cajun, German American, and many other communities, each carrying food knowledge into the crisis. Farm meals also followed the rhythm of labor. Breakfast might be substantial during planting or harvest, with bread, potatoes, eggs, gravy, or porridge depending on region and means. Midday dinner could be the largest meal. supper might use leftovers. During lean seasons, the pattern narrowed. Meat became occasional. Milk or eggs might be sold for cash instead of eaten at home. This painful choice, selling the most valuable food while consuming cheaper staples, appeared in many cash-poor agricultural households. The federal response to farm collapse sometimes created another contradiction. Programs aimed to raise prices by reducing surplus, while hungry families needed food. Emergency purchases later redirected wheat, pork, butter, cheese, flour, and other commodities into relief channels. The policy was complicated, controversial, and imperfect, but it recognized that farm crisis and urban hunger were connected. Before those programs expanded, much of the immediate burden fell on communities. Churches organized collections. Neighbors shared garden produce. Families doubled up in one house. Informal networks carried food from country relatives to city relatives and back again. A sack of flour or a jar of beans traveled through kinship as much as through commerce. But not everyone had land, relatives, or a pantry. In the cities, the most visible answer to hunger appeared in a line, sometimes around a block, sometimes outside a church basement, a municipal kitchen, or a private charity, where a bowl of soup became both nourishment and public evidence of economic collapse. The bread line is one of the enduring images of the Great Depression. Men in coats and hats stand close together, waiting outside a kitchen. The line seems silent. A sign may promise free coffee and donuts, soup, or a simple meal. Photographers captured such scenes because they made unemployment visible. A person who had once purchased lunch now waited for charity. Yet bread lines were only one part of urban food relief. Soup kitchens were operated by churches, missions, mutual aid societies, charities, municipalities, labor groups, and private individuals. Some served only men, others fed families. Some offered a bowl of soup and bread, others distributed groceries for home cooking. The quality, rules, and dignity of service varied widely. One famous Chicago kitchen was associated with Al Capone, but that story can distract from the larger network of ordinary relief workers and community organizations. Across the country, people cooked in church basements, settlement houses, school kitchens, and converted public buildings. Volunteers peeled potatoes, stirred large kettles, sliced bread, and tried to serve more people than their budgets allowed. The meal was usually designed for volume. Soup could carry beans, potatoes, cabbage, pasta, tomatoes, or small amounts of meat. Bread made it filling. Coffee or milk might be included. A kitchen needed foods that were cheap, predictable, easy to portion, and safe to cook in large quantities. Menus changed with donations and available commodities. Relief was not always easy to accept. American culture placed strong value on independence and paid work. Many unemployed people felt shame when asking for help, even though the crisis was far beyond individual control. Applicants could face interviews, home inspections, residency requirements, or judgments about whether they were deserving. Families sometimes delayed seeking assistance until cupboards were nearly empty. Discrimination shaped access. Black Americans were often the first fired and the last hired. In some communities, relief facilities were segregated or resources were distributed unequally. Mexican Americans, including U.S. citizens, faced coercive repatriation campaigns and exclusion. Immigrants sometimes feared that accepting aid could bring official scrutiny. Single women, domestic workers, and families without a stable address could fall outside local systems designed around male wage earners. Mutual aid helped fill the gaps. Ethnic associations, fraternal organizations, unions, neighborhood clubs, and religious congregations collected food and money. A Jewish relief agency might understand dietary customs that a general kitchen ignored. A black church could provide help in a community excluded from white institutions. Mexican-American families might rely on extended kin and local networks while facing hostile public policy. The grocery order was another common form of relief. Instead of a prepared meal, an agency issued a list or voucher for flour, beans, lard, canned milk, potatoes, bread, or other basics. This allowed families to cook at home, preserving a degree of privacy and cultural preference. But standardized orders could feel monotonous, and they did not always match household needs or cooking facilities. Private charity proved too small for a crisis of national scale. Early in the Depression, federal leaders often emphasized local and voluntary relief. As unemployment deepened, cities and charities ran out of money. The New Deal expanded federal involvement through emergency relief, work programs, agricultural purchases, and commodity distribution. Even then, the food system remained patchwork. A family might receive a county grocery order one week and surplus flour the next. A child might eat at school while adults skipped lunch. An unemployed worker might qualify for a work relief job and regain the ability to shop. Another person might remain outside every program. The line between relief and ordinary commerce also blurred. Some restaurants offered low-cost meals. Diners and lunch counters adjusted prices. Bakeries sold day-old bread. Street vendors and small cafes served filling dishes to workers and unemployed customers with only a few coins. In immigrant neighborhoods, inexpensive soups, pasta, beans, rice dishes, and breads came from long-standing culinary traditions rather than an official Depression menu. The city was therefore full of different food worlds. Behind one window, a family ate potatoes and cabbage. In a mission basement, a kettle of soup was being ladled. At a school, milk bottles waited in a crate. In a grocery, a shopkeeper considered whether to extend more credit. At a wholesale market, produce that could not be sold might spoil even while people nearby were hungry. This mismatch became one of the decade's central policy problems. If farms had wheat, pork, butter, or fruit that could not find a profitable market, and cities had families who could not afford food, could government connect the two? Before we reach that answer, we should enter another important kitchen, the carefully measured world of home economics, where experts tried to design a nutritious meal at the lowest possible cost. Home economics carried unusual authority during the 1930s. For decades, universities, extension services, women's magazines, and government agencies had promoted scientific household management. Food could be measured by calories, protein, minerals, vitamins, cost, and labor. A capable homemaker was expected to understand not only cooking, but budgeting, sanitation, child nutrition, and efficient use of fuel. During the Depression, this expertise became urgent. Newspapers printed economical menus. Radio programs offered household advice. Extension agents demonstrated canning, gardening, and low-cost cooking. Schools taught girls to plan meals that balanced nutrition and price. Government bulletins explained how to select cheaper cuts, use dried beans, protect milk for children, and avoid waste. The central promise was reassuring. Knowledge could make limited money go farther, and often it did. A planned shopping list reduced impulse purchases. Seasonal produce could be cheaper. Dried beans offered protein at lower cost than many meats. Whole grains and potatoes supplied energy. Milk, when available, supported children's diets. Careful storage reduced spoilage. One-pot meals saved fuel. Leftovers could be intentionally designed into the next day's menu. But the promise had limits. No amount of planning could create money that did not exist. A model menu might be nutritionally sound and still cost more than a relief family could spend. It might assume a refrigerator, an oven, clean water, or a nearby market. It might require time from a woman who was taking in laundry, caring for children, or searching for paid work. Advice also carried social judgment. Homemakers could be praised for thrift or blamed for waste. Poor diets were sometimes described as a failure of education rather than a consequence of poverty, discrimination, or inaccessible markets. The language of efficiency could hide the exhaustion required to soak, simmer, preserve, repair, and reuse every item in a household. At the White House, Eleanor Roosevelt supported public demonstrations of economical eating. Low-cost menus were intended to show solidarity, and responsible nutrition during the crisis. The effort attracted attention because the nation's most prominent household was discussing inexpensive meals. It also revealed the difficulty of translating nutritional theory into food people genuinely enjoyed. The broader home economics movement was more important than any one White House menu. County agents traveled to rural communities. Home demonstration clubs shared methods. Black extension agents worked with black farm families under segregated systems, often with fewer resources than white programs. Native communities encountered federal nutrition policies that could ignore or disrupt traditional foodways. Immigrant households adapted expert advice selectively, keeping the methods that fit their kitchens and rejecting those that did not. Published 1930s recipes show a fascination with the one-dish meal. Casseroles, molded salads, creamed foods on toast, and combinations of canned ingredients appeared frequently. These recipes reflected new appliances, packaged foods, advertising, and the desire to reduce labor. Some were economical, others required several commercial products, and belonged more to aspirational middle-class life than to the poorest homes. The measured recipe itself was becoming modern. Standard cups and spoons, exact oven temperatures, and step-by-step instructions made recipes easier to reproduce. Cookbooks designed for practical use became household tools, but many experienced cooks still worked by sight and touch, using a familiar cup, a pinch of salt, or the feel of dough. Nutrition science was also evolving. Vitamins had become a major public subject in the early 20th century. Experts emphasized milk, vegetables, fruit, eggs, and whole grains, especially for children. Yet the cheapest filling diet could be heavy in starch and short on these protective foods. Relief agencies therefore tried, with varying success, to distribute milk, produce, and other commodities alongside flour and staple grains. This gap between calories and nourishment mattered. A bowl of beans and bread could be sustaining. A diet of little but bread, potatoes, and coffee could leave serious deficiencies over time. The question was not simply whether people ate, but whether their meals offered enough variety for health. That question became especially visible in children. Teachers saw students arrive hungry. School attendance, concentration, and growth were affected by inadequate diets. Local lunch programs had existed before the Depression, but the crisis expanded the need and encouraged a new connection between agricultural surplus and the school cafeteria. In the lunchroom, nutrition theory would meet practical reality. Kettles, milk bottles, volunteer labor, donated food, and a room full of children waiting for the noon bell. There was no single American Depression table because there was no single American food culture. The country was a collection of regions and communities, each carrying older traditions into the crisis. When money became scarce, people often returned not to a newly invented poverty cuisine, but to foods their families already knew how to make economically. In Italian-American neighborhoods, pasta, beans, bread, tomatoes, greens, and soups could create filling meals with modest amounts of meat. Pasta e fagioli and similar combinations were not Depression inventions. They were durable traditions suited to thrift. In Jewish households, soups, noodles, potatoes, cabbage, barley, beans, bread, and carefully used fats followed regional and religious customs. Kosher practice shaped which relief foods were acceptable. Community organizations sometimes provided assistance better aligned with those needs. Polish, Ukrainian, Slovak, German, and other Central and Eastern European families brought knowledge of cabbage, potatoes, rye bread, dumplings, beets, barley, pickles, and sausages used more as seasoning when money was short. A pot of cabbage and potatoes could feel familiar rather than merely deprived. Across the South, Black food traditions drew on generations of agricultural knowledge and survival under slavery, Reconstruction, tenancy, and segregation. Cornmeal, field peas, beans, greens, sweet potatoes, rice in coastal areas, and small amounts of pork seasoning formed part of complex regional cuisines. The Depression intensified hardship, but it did not create the skill with which cooks transformed these ingredients. White Southern farm families often relied on many of the same regional staples, though access to land, credit, and relief was deeply unequal. Shared ingredients did not mean shared social conditions. In Mexican-American and Southwestern communities, beans, tortillas, corn, rice, chiles, squash, and stews were part of established foodways. Families adjusted portions and fillings as wages fell. Yet public memory sometimes describes these foods as if they were simply cheap substitutes. They were also sources of identity, continuity, and pleasure. Indigenous communities had their own food systems, shaped by local ecosystems and by long histories of federal displacement and control. During the Depression, New Deal programs reached native nations unevenly. Government commodities sometimes supplemented diets, but federal policy could also disrupt traditional food production. A national story must leave room for these differences, rather than forcing every community into the same pantry. In New England, beans, brown bread, fish when locally available, dairy products, potatoes, and seasonal preserves reflected older regional patterns. In the Midwest, dairy, grains, potatoes, cabbage, noodles, and farm-raised meat varied with settlement and agriculture. Along the coasts and rivers, fishing could supply food, though equipment, access, season, and local regulation mattered. Urban neighborhoods added another layer. A worker could buy a bowl of soup, a plate of beans, a sandwich, or a serving of noodles from a small restaurant rooted in a particular immigrant community. These businesses also struggled, but they sometimes offered inexpensive meals more satisfying than standardized relief fare. Regional food knowledge provided flexibility. A cook who understood tortillas could turn a small amount of beans or potatoes into several meals. Someone skilled with dumplings could extend broth. A baker could use stale bread in pudding. A Southern cook could use pot liquor from greens. A Jewish cook might turn chicken fat into a valuable seasoning. A Chinese-American restaurant could serve rice and vegetable dishes at prices accessible to customers, though Chinese-American communities themselves faced discrimination and economic hardship. The Depression, therefore, did not flatten American food. It revealed how much survival depended on inherited knowledge. It also produced exchange. Relief commodities entered unfamiliar kitchens. Packaged foods crossed regional lines. Radio and magazines spread recipes. Migrants carried dishes to new places. A family leaving Oklahoma for California brought habits of beans, biscuits, gravy, and preserved food. An African-American family moving within the Great Migration carried Southern techniques into northern cities. Mexican-American workers moved with agricultural seasons, adapting meals to camps and temporary housing. Some foods later remembered as universal were actually local. A tomato and macaroni stew might be common in one neighborhood and unknown in another. Cornmeal mush could be breakfast in one household, polenta in another, and a food of last resort somewhere else. Beans might be seasoned with molasses, chiles, pork, or nothing more than salt. This is why memory must be treated with care. When people later recalled what we ate in the Depression, they often described one family, one region, one season, and one level of hardship. Their memories are valuable, but they do not automatically represent the entire country. The same caution applies to famous recipes circulated online today. Some are authentic period foods. Some existed long before the Depression. Some became associated with the era only later. The truest picture is not a list of 10 dishes. It is a map of adaptation. And nowhere was adaptation more visible than on the road west, where families escaping drought and foreclosure had to carry their food habits into camps, automobiles, and fields far from home. The Dust Bowl did not cover the entire United States, and it was not identical to the Great Depression. It was a regional environmental disaster within the larger economic crisis. Drought, soil erosion, and destructive farming practices turned parts of the Great Plains into a landscape of failed crops and severe dust storms. Families lost farms, livestock, and the ability to remain where they had built their lives. Many moved. Some traveled to California and other western states, following reports of agricultural work. They carried mattresses, tools, cooking pots, bedding, and whatever food could survive the road. The journey might involve bread, beans, potatoes, canned goods, coffee, flour, cornmeal, or food purchased a little at a time. Meals were cooked at roadside stops, camps, or temporary settlements. The iconic migrant photographs of the 1930s show more than hunger. They show kettles, wash tubs, makeshift stoves, boxes used as tables, and children eating near tents or cars. These objects reveal the work of maintaining a household without a stable house. Water had to be found. Fuel had to be gathered or purchased. Food had to be protected from dust, heat, insects, and spoilage. In migrant camps, meals depended on wages. Agricultural work was seasonal and uncertain. When many workers arrived for the same harvest, pay could fall. A family might have access to fresh produce while picking it and still be unable to afford enough food. Bruised or discarded fruit could sometimes be gathered, but rules varied, and taking produce without permission risked conflict. Beans were practical because they traveled well, but they required time and fuel. Flour could become biscuits, pancakes, or gravy. Potatoes were filling, but heavy to carry. Canned milk lasted longer than fresh milk. Coffee offered warmth and routine, even when the meal was sparse. Children experienced the road differently from adults. A campfire meal could feel briefly like an adventure, but instability carried serious costs. Schooling was interrupted. Sanitation was poor in many informal camps. Illness and inadequate diets were common concerns. Government migrant camps later provided cleaner water, toilets, and organized facilities in some locations, though they reached only part of the population. The migrants, often labeled Okies, came from northern Oklahoma. The term became a broad and sometimes insulting label for poor southwestern migrants. They faced hostility in California, where established residents feared competition for work and public relief. Food could mark them as outsiders. Biscuits, gravy, beans, and other familiar foods traveled with them, as did church suppers, music, and family customs. Over time, these traditions became part of California's agricultural and working-class culture. The road west also exposed the strange geography of abundance. California produced fruit and vegetables on a large scale, yet workers who harvested crops could go hungry. Produce could be destroyed or left unpicked when prices were too low, while families nearby lacked money. This was the same Depression contradiction seen nationally. Food existed, but access depended on wages and markets. Farm Security Administration photographers documented migrant life partly to build support for federal programs. Their photographs are invaluable, but they were also created within a public project. A camera framed one moment. It could show a mother beside a lean-to, but not every meal that came before or after. It could reveal hardship without fully capturing humor, skill, or family affection. Oral histories add other details. People remembered frying dough, cooking beans, gathering greens, eating fruit in season, or going without. Some remembered kindness from strangers. Others remembered humiliation. Many recalled that children did not always understand how poor the family was, because adults worked to protect them from the full reality. Food on the road was therefore both material and emotional. A familiar biscuit or pot of beans could make a temporary camp feel like home. A shared meal restored order to a day controlled by travel and uncertain work. A mother who served children first was managing not only calories but fear. As federal relief expanded, policymakers began looking for ways to serve children before hunger damaged health and education. The school lunchroom became one place where surplus food, local labor, and public responsibility could meet. School meals in the United States began long before the National School Lunch Act of 1946. Cities, charities, Parent groups and schools had experimented with lunches in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Some programs sold inexpensive meals. Others offered free food to children identified as needy. The Depression greatly expanded both the need and the public argument for school feeding. Teachers could see hunger. A child who had eaten little breakfast might struggle to concentrate. Some arrived with a piece of bread or a cold potato. Others brought nothing. In rural districts, long travel made it difficult to return home at noon. In cities, overcrowded housing and unemployed parents placed additional pressure on family meals. Local programs used whatever resources they had. A school kitchen might serve vegetable soup, beans, cocoa, milk, sandwiches, oatmeal, or a simple hot dish. Parent-teacher associations raised money. Volunteers cooked. Home economics students sometimes helped prepare meals. In communities with no kitchen, food could be warmed on classroom stoves or brought from a central facility. The meal served more than one purpose. It fed children, taught table manners and nutrition, and created work for unemployed adults. It also offered a market for agricultural products. During the 1930s, federal surplus commodity programs increasingly supplied foods to schools and institutions. This connection helped farmers by removing excess products from the market while helping children whose families lacked purchasing power. The foods varied with surplus in season. Flour, milk products, butter, cheese, fruits, vegetables, or meat could appear through distribution programs. Schools still needed storage, cooks, fuel, equipment, and local organization. A donated commodity did not become lunch by itself. Rural schools faced particular challenges. Some had no running water, electricity, or dedicated kitchen. A teacher might supervise both lessons and meal preparation. Communities improvised with large pots, jars from home, garden produce, and shared labor. In other places, school gardens provided vegetables and practical instruction. Segregation shaped school meals as it shaped education. Black schools in the South often received fewer public resources. Buildings, kitchens, and equipment were inferior or absent. Black teachers, parents, and community organizations worked to feed children despite unequal funding. Federal commodities could help, but local administration still reflected discriminatory systems. Native children experienced school feeding within a history of federal boarding schools that had used food as a tool of control and assimilation. Meals could provide needed nutrition, yet institutions often disregarded traditional foods and family autonomy. This history complicates any simple story of benevolent assistance. For many children, however, the school lunch was remembered with gratitude. A bowl of hot soup on a cold day could be the most dependable meal available. Milk was especially valued because home economists emphasized it for growth, and because many families could not afford regular delivery. Bread with a warm dish created the feeling of a complete noon meal. The lunchroom also made hunger public. When one child received free food and another paid, social differences could become visible. Some programs tried to reduce stigma by serving all children together or by allowing payment in different forms. Others separated recipients, intentionally or not. The Depression helped move school lunch from local charity toward public policy. By the end of the decade, the federal government had gained experience purchasing and distributing surplus commodities. Schools became important outlets. The permanent national program would not arrive until after World War II, but the administrative roots were already in place. A noon meal also changed the household budget. If a child ate at school, a parent could reserve more food for younger children or supper. The benefit traveled home indirectly. A school lunch could not solve unemployment, but it could create one reliable point in an otherwise uncertain day. Children sometimes carried the lessons home as well. They learned about vegetables, milk, and balanced plates. Whether families could act on that advice was another matter. Still, the idea that nutrition was a public concern had taken hold. The next step was broader and more experimental. Could families shop in ordinary stores using a special form of purchasing power, while the government directed extra demand toward foods farmers could not sell? In 1939, the first federal food stamp program began to test that possibility. The first food stamp program looked different from the program Americans know today. It began in 1939 as an experiment with two colors of stamps. Participating households purchased orange stamps roughly equal to the amount they normally spent on food. For each dollar of orange stamps, they received additional blue stamps. Orange stamps could buy most foods. Blue stamps could be used only for products the government had designated as surplus. The design joined two problems. Low-income families needed more food. Farmers needed markets for excess production. The stamps were meant to increase purchasing power while moving surplus commodities through ordinary grocery stores. The first transaction took place in Rochester, New York, in May 1939. That small purchase represented a new relationship among household, retailer, farmer, and federal government. Instead of receiving only a standardized box or grocery order, a participant could shop in a store. Choice remained limited by the program rules and by what the store carried, but the setting was closer to normal commerce. The program was not available everywhere. It expanded to many areas and reached millions of people before ending in 1943, when wartime employment and changing surpluses reduced the conditions that had created it. Participation also required households to purchase the orange stamps with cash, which could exclude the very poorest families. Still, the experiment mattered. It showed that food assistance could operate through retail markets. It also made visible the federal government's attempt to manage abundance and hunger together. Commodity distribution continued alongside the stamps. Beginning in the early New Deal years, the Federal Surplus Relief Corporation and related agencies purchased farm products for relief. Wheat, flour, pork, butter, cheese, and other foods moved through public channels. In 1933, federal authorities purchased more than 16 million bushels of wheat for relief distribution. Emergency livestock programs also directed large amounts of edible pork to relief, while other purchases included dairy products and flour. These programs were controversial. Critics questioned production controls and the destruction or removal of crops and livestock at a time when people were hungry. Officials argued that collapsing farm prices threatened the entire agricultural economy and that some purchased products were being processed for relief. The tension was real. Policy tried to reduce surplus in markets while also feeding people who lacked income. At the household level, the policy arrived as a sack, a package, a voucher, or a new item in the kitchen. Surplus flour might increase bread baking. Cheese could appear where a family rarely bought it. Dried or canned commodities might not fit familiar recipes, requiring adaptation. Relief recipients developed ways to trade advice and make the foods acceptable. Distribution quality varied. Storage and transportation mattered. Local agencies determined how efficiently food reached families. Some recipients appreciated the help, but disliked the lack of choice. Others faced stigma or intrusive eligibility rules. The government also supported work relief rather than food alone. A wage from a public works job restored purchasing power and allowed families to shop according to preference. For many Americans, work relief felt more dignified than direct charity. Yet jobs were limited. Eligibility rules excluded some, and wages did not erase every hardship. Food policy in the 1930s was therefore not one program, but a developing system. Local soup kitchens, grocery orders, school lunches, commodity distribution, farm programs, work relief, and food stamps overlapped. Each addressed a different part of the crisis. None reached everyone. The decade also expanded the federal administrative capacity that later shaped wartime nutrition and post-war food assistance. The National School Lunch Program, permanent food stamps, and modern commodity programs came later, but they inherited lessons from the Depression. One lesson was simple. Hunger could not be explained only by a lack of food. It could exist amid full warehouses and productive farms when wages, prices, markets, and public policy failed to connect supply with need. Another lesson was quieter. Choice matters. A household is not merely a destination for calories. Food carries culture, dignity, memory, and control. A bag of flour is useful only if there is a place to store it, fuel to bake it, and someone with time to cook. By the end of the 1930s, many families had survived years of adaptation. Some regained work, others remained poor. The coming war would transform employment, agriculture, rationing, and household consumption again. But the habits formed during the Depression did not disappear. They remained in jars, recipe cards, saved grease tins, family sayings, and the instinct to look at leftovers and ask what they might become tomorrow. When people remembered the Great Depression later in life, they often remembered food with unusual clarity. They remembered the smell of beans cooking all afternoon. They remembered bread and gravy, potato soup, cornmeal mush, cabbage, rice, biscuits, oatmeal, or a rare piece of meat divided among several children. They remembered taking lunch to school in a reused container. They remembered a garden, a relief package, or a grocer who continued to extend credit. Some memories were warm. A simple meal could be associated with family closeness, a grandmother's skill, or the comfort of a familiar kitchen. Other memories carried embarrassment. A child might hide a plain lunch from classmates. An adult might remember standing in a relief line or pretending not to be hungry. Both kinds of memory are true. Food can hold affection and hardship at the same time. The Depression also left a powerful moral language around thrift. People who lived through it often saved string, foil, jars, bread, and leftovers long after their income improved. Waste felt dangerous because they had seen security disappear. A full pantry offered emotional reassurance. Some of these habits became part of mainstream mid-century cooking. Casseroles, leftover transformations, economical meat dishes, canned ingredients, and refrigerator management continued into the 1940s and 1950s. The growth of electric refrigeration made planned leftovers easier. Wartime rationing soon reinforced the message that households should conserve food and avoid waste, though the reasons were different. The era also produced myths. One myth is that every poor family ate the same handful of dishes. Another is that all rural people had plenty because they lived near farms. A third is that hunger could always be solved by better homemaking. These stories flatten the past. The reality was more varied. A family with a garden and relatives nearby had advantages over a family in a rented room. A household with stable relief access differed from one excluded by race, citizenship status, residence rules, or local prejudice. A cook with an oven and fuel had options unavailable to someone with one burner. A child receiving school lunch lived a different noon hour from a child whose school had no program. The phrase, "what poor Americans ate," must therefore remain plural. They ate foods shaped by region, work, race, culture, season, housing, equipment, and public policy. They ate ordinary American foods in reduced amounts. They ate traditional dishes made with fewer expensive ingredients. They ate relief commodities. They skipped meals. They stretched meals. They shared meals. And sometimes, they ate well for a day. A successful garden, a church supper, a holiday, a fishing trip, a relative's visit, or a rare paycheck could bring abundance to the table. Poverty was not a perfectly even condition. It rose and fell within the week and the year. The most enduring lesson may be found in the relationship between food and dignity. Soup kitchens prevented hunger, but a paid job restored choice. Grocery orders supplied staples, but they could not account for every culture. School lunches supported children, but unequal schools delivered unequal meals. Federal purchases moved surplus, but the system remained complicated and incomplete. The Depression forced Americans to ask whether hunger was a private failure or a public responsibility. The answer changed slowly. By the end of the decade, federal involvement in agriculture, relief, nutrition, and school feeding had become much larger than it had been in 1929. The programs were imperfect, but the political boundary had moved. Food history allows us to see that change at table level. A distant law could become flour in a pantry. A farm policy could become cheese in a school lunch. A public works wage could become potatoes, milk, and coffee purchased at the corner store. An electrical loan could eventually make a refrigerator possible, allowing leftovers to last another day. Large systems entered the home through small objects: a stamp, a jar, a milk bottle, a sack of meal, a soup ladle. And now, after following these objects across the decade, we can return to the quiet kitchen where we began. The enamel pot is nearly empty. The bread heel has been divided. One bowl remains on the table, with a spoon resting inside it. The meal was modest, but it was not simple. Behind it stood a grocer's account book, a farmer's low prices, a woman's unpaid labor, a child's school day, a relief workers list, and a government learning, slowly, how to connect food with need. The final chapter is not about another recipe. It is about the table itself, and why the memory of that table remained long after the Depression ended. Night has settled over the street. The stove is cooling now, and the kitchen window has turned dark enough to reflect the room. 4 bowls have been washed and placed upside down on a folded cloth. The last jar on the shelf catches a little light. What poor Americans ate during the Great Depression cannot be reduced to one dish. There were beans and potatoes, cornmeal and bread, cabbage and rice, oats and pasta. There were gardens, chickens, milk bottles, canned goods, soup bones, day-old loaves, and carefully saved leftovers. There were school lunches and relief kitchens. There were foods carried through African American, Mexican American, immigrant, indigenous, regional, and family traditions. There were meals that nourished, meals that merely filled, and days when there was not enough. The crisis did not invent thrift. It made thrift necessary on a national scale. It asked households to perform impossible calculations and then praise them when the results looked effortless. It revealed the strength of community networks and also their limits. It showed that a country could produce food in abundance while allowing hunger to spread through unemployment, low farm prices, discrimination, and failed access. The answer that emerged was incomplete, but important. Food relief became more public. Surplus commodities moved into schools and homes. Work programs restored wages to some families. The first food stamps tested a way to bring purchasing power back into ordinary stores. Nutrition became part of public discussion, especially where children were concerned. None of this erased hardship, but it changed what Americans believed government might be responsible for doing. In family memory, the decade often survives through small instructions. Save the bread ends. Do not waste the broth. Put a little water in the jar and shake out the last of it. Use the good plate, but only on Sunday. Feed the children first. Those instructions were practical, but they were also emotional. They carried the memory of uncertainty and the hope that careful use could protect a household from the next loss. Perhaps that is why Depression-era food stories remain so powerful. They are not only stories about scarcity, they are stories about attention. Attention to the price of flour, attention to the weather, attention to what remains in the pot, attention to the neighbor who may need a meal. In a modern kitchen, it is easy to see a leftover as something finished. In the Depression kitchen, it was often something waiting. A spoonful of beans could begin tomorrow's soup. A crust could become pudding. A bone could become broth. A small garden could become winter jars. Nothing promised abundance, but each item carried one more possibility. The room is very quiet now. Somewhere far away, a train moves through the darkness, carrying produce, flour, milk, or people toward another town. The sound reaches the window and fades. On the table, the cloth beneath the bowls is almost dry. The stove gives off its final warmth, and for a little while, there is nothing left to measure, nothing left to divide, and nothing more that must be saved tonight. The kitchen can rest, and so can you.